So today we'll just start with anatomy, maybe get through the physiology of the hypothalamus and pituitary gland. We'll pick up more with physiology on Monday. So to begin with anatomy, we have the endocrine glands that are just glands. And then we also have organs that have endocrine tissue in them. So what are these? As far as endocrine glands go, just straightforward glands. The first is the pituitary, up in the head. And this is actually the master gland. So it releases 6 trophic hormones that are going to control our other glands. So we call it the master gland. The thyroid is just an endocrine gland. It releases thyroid hormones that we'll talk more about. I skipped the pineal gland. The pineal gland is also in the head, and it is just a gland. This is part of the epithalamus. The adrenal glands are also just endocrine glands. But that's it for just the organs that are just glands. Everything else that is secreting a hormone is an organ that's got endocrine tissue. So the first up in the head is the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is the master controller of the endocrine system. It's not the master gland because it's not just a gland, but it is the master controller. Then next we have the thymus that releases a hormone that will help with T-cell maturation. So the thymus is an organ that has some endocrine function. The heart actually also releases a hormone called atrial natriuretic peptide. We're not going to talk about that this chapter. We'll talk about that when we go over the cardiovascular system. But the heart also has some endocrine function. The stomach releases a hormone called gastrin that helps with regulation of digestion. The small intestine releases a hormone called cholecystokinin. These two we'll talk about when we get to the digestive system. The pancreas. The pancreas has endocrine and exocrine functions, so we'll talk about its endocrine functions this chapter, and we'll talk about its exocrine functions when we get to the digestive system. And your gonads, which are the testes and the ovaries. So we'll talk a little bit about them because we're going to go through the pathway of the hypothalamus pituitary gonad axis. So we'll talk a little bit about them, but we're going to spend most of our discussion of the gonads at the end of the semester when we get to the reproductive system. So that's just kind of an overview of what we're going to be looking at. So let's talk in more detail about these things. What's the anatomy of these structures? The hypothalamus and the pituitary up in the head are really what's going to get all of our different what are called axes started. So our hypothalamus is that weird section of the diencephalon that hangs down underneath the thalamus, and it's got a bunch of nuclei in it. What are nuclei in the central nervous system?
Like bundles of axons.
Oh, bundles of, not axons. They're bundles of somas in the central nervous system. So it's gray matter that's deep to the white matter. So these are, we'll say, nuclei, which is gray matter, deep to our white matter in the central nervous system. So we've got a bunch of these different nuclei that are releasing 2 different types of hormones. Releasing hormones and release inhibiting hormones. So these nuclei have the somas of these neurons gathered all up in these nice organized regions, and then their axons come down and terminate in this region called the median eminence. So this region here gets several names. So we're going to look and see a bunch of different names for these things. So this is called the median eminence. It's also called pars tuberalis. And at this region, we've got some blood vessels that are going to be attached through these portal veins to more blood vessels. This whole conglomeration of blood vessels attached by these veins to these other blood vessels is called the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So it's a portal system because the blood in these capillary networks is actually going to pass through two capillary beds before returning to the general circulation. We'll talk about some normal circulatory pathways for your next test, but in most of your capillary beds in the body, oxygenated nutrient-rich blood will enter a capillary bed, and you'll have exchange of nutrients and respiratory gases, and then it gets picked back up in veins that are going to return it to the heart. In a portal system, you actually go through two capillary beds before returning to the general circulation. So this is the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system, and the reason it's called hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system is because this pituitary here is also called the hypophysis. So the hypophysis is the pituitary. And that portal system is going to be how we connect this region, the median eminence up here, down to our anterior pituitary. So if we look at our pituitary, it actually gets divided into an anterior and a posterior. So this is anterior. And our posterior pituitary is back here. So the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system is how we're going to connect our neurons here that are releasing these releasing hormones and release inhibiting hormones to our anterior pituitary. Our anterior pituitary then is going to release a bunch of hormones called trophic hormones. We'll go over that in just a minute. I'll use this board to show you the general relationship, and then on this board I'll go through the specifics. Another thing to be aware of about this system, the posterior pituitary has a unique relationship to the hypothalamus in that it is the extension of the axons that are coming down from the hypothalamus. So we've got other neurons that will stretch down and synapse on the posterior pituitary and release neurohormones directly into the blood. And this is called our hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. So let's see.
And they're only on the posterior?
Yep. I'm going to write this over here. So that posterior pituitary is our hypothalamo-hypophyseal tract. And then we have a couple more names that we can call these things. This anterior pituitary also gets called the adenohypophysis. Adeno referring to glandular, hypophysis referring to pituitary. It also is called the pars distalis. And then our posterior pituitary, this is all nervous tissue. So our posterior pituitary is called the neurohypophysis. So that's the anatomical relationship of the hypothalamus to the pituitary. let's look at it in a little bit more detail so we can talk about all of the cells present. So anatomy is structure, physiology is function. So the structures that are involved are going to be the cells that we find there. So if we look up here, we've got these neurons that are synapsing on this region called the median eminence. And then we've got other neurons that are coming down and dumping neurohormones directly into the blood. So you don't have to worry. I'm not going to make you worry about the specific names of each of the nuclei. That's something you can do if you go into endocrinology later. Just be aware that our release and inhibiting hormones are being emptied into this primary plexus of our hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system. So this first capillary bed is called the primary plexus. And it's attached to the secondary plexus by these portal veins. And this secondary plexus is surrounding all of the cells down here in the anterior pituitary. In our posterior pituitary, these neurons are making two hormones, one called oxytocin and one called antidiuretic hormone. We'll talk more about the physiology of those hormones when we get to physiology. For now, we're just going through the anatomy and the structures. Up here, all of the nuclei that are synapsing onto the median eminence are the neurons that are that are producing and secreting our releasing hormones and release inhibiting hormones. And those hormones are going to travel through this hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system and surround cells down here in the anterior pituitary that are going to be releasing our trophic hormones. So I'm going to erase this for now so that I can draw in all of our other cells that are going to be releasing our trophic hormones. So down here we have cells called corticotropes. And our corticotropes are going to release a trophic hormone called ACTH. Another part of the endocrine system, kind of pain in the butt, is you have to learn this stuff called hormone nomenclature. So you've got to learn all of these abbreviations for hormones, but then what they stand for. ACTH is the Adrenal Corticotropic Hormone. What's kind of cool about these hormones is once you learn the name, it kind of tells you what they do. So this is Adrenal Corticotropic Hormone. So if we break this down, adreno is referring to the adrenal glands. Cortico is referring to a specific type of steroid called a corticosteroid. This is your stress hormone. Tropic means to make. So when ACTH hits the adrenal glands, it'll cause the adrenal glands to make this corticosteroid, cortisol. So we'll talk again more about that when we get to physiology. But just be aware that in the anterior pituitary we have these corticotropes that release ACTH. Corticotropes have a specialized receptor for the hormone CRH, which is corticotropin releasing hormone, and that's coming from the hypothalamus. It's one of these releasing hormones. So CRH is corticotropin releasing hormone. So it's released from neurons in the hypothalamus into the median eminence. It travels through the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system and pulls around all of the cells in the anterior pituitary. It binds to CRH receptors on corticotropes, and those cells release ACTH to the blood. All right. So what's another one? Other cell types that we have in the anterior pituitary are called thyrotropes. And they release a hormone called TSH. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone. Gonadotropes have receptors for a releasing hormone called TRH, or thyrotropin releasing hormone. All right. Other cells that we have down here in the anterior pituitary are called lactotropes. Lactotropes release a hormone called prolactin. Prolactin, just like it sounds, is prolactation. So it stimulates the mammary glands to produce milk. So PRL is prolactin. And lactotropes are actually under inhibition most of the time. And they've got a receptor for the modified amino acid dopamine. Dopamine is prolactin release inhibiting hormone. So prolactin release inhibiting hormone is dopamine. And so dopamine is being released from these these hypothalamic neurons into the median eminence all the time under normal situations, under normal circumstances. When a woman goes through labor and delivery, she has a massive surge in oxytocin. Oxytocin stimulates uterine contraction. That oxytocin, as long as oxytocin is present in the system, will inhibit prolactin release inhibiting hormone. So if you inhibit the inhibitor, then the lactotropes are free to go. Your book also says that there's a prolactin releasing hormone. The evidence is not great for that in humans. So in some mammals, they do have a prolactin releasing hormone, but it's not necessary in all animals. So I'm not going to test you on that one. More importantly is to be aware that these cells are under inhibition all of the time, unless something abnormal like having a baby happens, and then they'll be released from their inhibition. So prolactin is the next trophic hormone, and it's going to stimulate the mammary glands to produce milk. Okay, then we've got these other cells down here in the anterior pituitary called gonadotropes. And gonadotropes release two hormones. One's called FSH, and one's called LH. FSH is the follicle stimulating hormone. These get their names for what they do in females. So follicle stimulating hormone stimulates the development of a follicle around an oocyte. That follicle will support the growing oocyte. Luteinizing hormone, LH, is luteinizing hormone. And this is the hormone that causes rupture of the follicle or ovulation. So luteinizing hormone is LH. And these cells have receptors for the releasing hormone GnRH, which is gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then the last trophic hormone is growth hormone, and it's coming from cells called somatotropes. So our somatotropes release growth hormone. This is our last trophic hormone. And our somatotropes are actually under dual regulation. So they've got receptors for growth hormone release inhibiting hormone, which is also called somatostatin, and they've got receptors for growth hormone releasing hormone. So our somatotropes are under both inhibitory and stimulatory control. So somatostatin is our growth hormone release inhibiting hormone. And they also have receptors for growth hormone releasing hormone. So over here on the left, we've got all of our release and release inhibiting hormones that are coming from the hypothalamus and being released into that primary plexus. They can then travel down through the hypothalamal hypoxia portal system and pool around cells in the anterior pituitary. Only the cells with receptors for a specific releasing hormone or release inhibiting hormone will respond. So, and then they will respond by releasing their trophic hormone. So all of these hormones over here are our trophic hormones. So all of our release and release inhibiting hormones are neurohormones because they're being released from neurons into blood. So all of these are neurohormones. And they all are also peptides or proteins. Peptides are just basically chains of amino acids, 3 to 50 amino acids long. So they behave just like protein hormones. Protein hormones are 50 amino acids or more. So by method of release, all of our release and release inhibiting hormones are called neurohormones. Chemical classification would be peptide or protein. Now, if we look at our trophic hormones, by method of release, they're just hormones because they're being released from the anterior pituitary, which is a gland, and they're being released into the blood. By chemical classification, these all are also peptides or proteins. Not until we get out into the system that we have other chemical classifications. So is there any questions on the anatomy of the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland? Don't worry, we're going to cover all of this again. We'll go through each of these pathways one at a time. When we get, we're going to cover each pathway one at a time so that it's not all a jumbled up mess. But this is kind of where we're getting to, understanding all of this stuff. So next time, draw your picture instead of taking your picture. That's what I gave you this big piece of paper for. But you can do it.
So then on the posterior side, are those all different hormones?
It's just these two, oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. And they're under neural control or humoral control. So oxytocin is released in response to orgasm, or in the case of when a woman is going into labor and the baby drops and pushes on the cervix, that starts a pathway that gets oxytocin release going. So that's under neural control. Antidiuretic hormone is under what's called humoral control. It's released when you're dehydrated. So diuresis is peeing. So antidiuretic hormone is anti-PEG. So when antidiuretic hormone is present in the system, it'll cause your kidneys to pull water out of what was becoming urine. So again, we'll talk more about those. We're going to talk more about all of this when we go through physiology. I just kind of wanted to give you an introduction to the anatomy for now, so that we have the structures that are involved, and then we'll go over the physiology. And I actually, this semester, added a whole extra day for the endocrine system because it's a lot of information, and I just want to make sure everybody's really comfortable with it. So we'll have 2 full days to talk about physiology. Any other questions on anatomy so far of this part? Okay. Then let's talk about our glands now, specifically. The pineal gland sits up in the brain. It's part of the diencephalon. So if we look, our thalamus is like this big region that hangs down into our hypothalamus, and at the back of it, we have the epithalamus and the pineal gland kind of sat back here. The pineal gland, the cells in the pineal gland are called pinealocytes, and they release melatonin. Melatonin is the hormone that helps get you ready for going to sleep. So as the sun is going down, melatonin production starts going up. We'll talk more about the physiology. I guess we can actually just talk about the physiology of it right now because we're not going to really hit the pineal gland much more. So as the sun's going down and it's getting dark, you get these visual pathways or information through your visual pathways that actually synapses on the pineal gland so that it's aware of the state of light. And as it starts getting dark, you start releasing these guys from inhibition, and then you start ramping up melatonin production, and melatonin helps cause sleepiness. But in diurnal animals, so we're daytime waking animals, so we're called diurnal. And so melatonin causes sleepiness in us. Melatonin comes on at night in everyone, in nocturnal animals as well. So it has different effects in nocturnal animals than it does in diurnal animals. So for us, it causes sleepiness. And an interesting thing about the pineal gland is that even in legally blind people, most legally blind people don't have a disruption in the pathway that's bringing light information to the pineal gland. So their pineal gland will reset every day with the sun going down. So unless you have full, full malformation in all visual pathways, you get input even if you can't see. So most blind people still reset to the 24-hour cycle. What's interesting about this, they've done experiments to see how the pineal gland works, and they'll take people and just go put them in caves, like these deep, dark caves, for months. And so they're not getting any light input. They're just in the dark all the time, and they'll watch their melatonin secretion rhythm. And most people are either shorter than 24 hours or a little bit longer than 24 hours. Not by a whole lot, but a little bit. So morning people tend to have shorter than 24-hour cycles. Night people tend to have a little bit longer than 24-hour cycles. But it resets every day with the sun going down so that we can all stay on this 24-hour light-dark cycle. So it's kind of interesting. They do that with mice as well. Like put them in either full light or full dark and see the effect and track their melatonin secretion. And nobody's a perfect 24 hours, but it gets reset every day by the sun going down so that we can all maintain this 24-hour light cycle. So that's pretty much all I need to say about that. The thyroid gland is our next gland that we need to talk about. It's this kind of Honda symbol shaped gland that sits in your anterior to your trachea. So we looked at it a little bit last time. When you're going through your lab, come look at these models for sure. So the thyroid gland sits here in front of your trachea, and it's made of a bunch of what are called thyroid follicles. So it contains many follicles. If you look look at the model, it looks like there are all these like little circle blob things. Each one of these is a thyroid follicle. So in these thyroid follicles are three-dimensional structures, and they're made of these cells called follicular cells. So if we were to break one of them open and look down at it, then our thyroid follicle has a bunch of these follicular cells. Our follicular cells are cuboidal cells that have microvilli. Cuboidal cells are really important where secretion and absorption are necessary. In this case, we're going to be secreting thyroid hormones. And we have to have so many microvilli because we want to increase surface area. So if you look at the thyroid follicles, if we're looking down at it, it's got a ton of these follicular cells that are facing in toward this protein-rich substance called colloid. Thyroid hormone is the only hormone that's synthesized extracellularly. Thyroid hormone is made out here in the colloid. These follicles are made of follicular cells. So I'm going to draw a follicular cell bigger. So one thing we said about epithelial cells is they all have an apical and a basal surface. The basal surface of all of our thyroid follicular cells is out here, facing the outside of the follicle. So this is a three-dimensional structure. So the whole outside, what you're looking at on the outside of this is the basal side of all of our follicular cells. The apical surface has these microvilli that's facing in toward the colloid. So this is our basal side, and this is what's in contact with the blood. Our apical surface is in contact with the colloid. So our thyroid follicular cells are pretty darn interesting. On their basal surface, they have Tsh receptors. TSH is thyroid stimulating hormone, the trophic hormone. So when there's when this hormone is present in the system, it's a protein or a peptide, so it's going to activate second messengers that do a ton of stuff in this cell. We'll talk more about it when we get to physiology. But ultimately, it will result in the release of thyroid hormone back out to the blood. So our thyroid follicular cells are the cells that are making our thyroid hormone. And they're all gathered up making these follicles. So those are the first structures to be aware of. The thyroid also has other cells. Do you have a question?
TSH receptors?
Yeah, they've got TSH receptors. So receptors for our thyroid stimulating hormone. All of our glands are highly vascularized. So there are lots of capillaries around this thyroid. So when there's TSH in the blood, it'll bind to the basal side of those thyroid follicular cells and create a cascade of events inside the cell because we're doing second messengers. Thyroid hormone production is very complicated. It requires iodine, so it needs special pumps, it needs special enzymes. So those second messengers are going to get all of that going. But one of the immediate effects is that we'll release thyroid hormone back out into the blood. So we'll talk more about that when we get to the physiology. There's another type of cell present in the thyroid, in between our follicles. So these other cells, they're called parafollicular cells. Well, this side of the board is not right well. Okay, there's para, which means near the follicle. Parafollicular cells, which are also called C cells. I kind of like the name C cells because it kind of tells you what they're doing. They're releasing the hormone calcitonin. Does anybody who's had me before remember my poem?
Calcitonin puts the bone in.
Calcitonin puts the bone in! Right! So, when you have high levels of blood calcium, your parafollicular cells will respond by releasing calcitonin, and calcitonin can help with calcium absorption, calcium deposition in your blood. And it helps, so it'll help to, it'll stimulate your osteoblast to lay down osteoid, It will stimulate your small intestine. Well, it inhibits your small intestine from absorbing calcium, and it stimulates your kidneys to excrete calcium. So those are other cells that are important to be aware of, and they're hanging out there in between the follicles. So parafollicular cells, or C cells, release calcitonin. Again, we'll talk more about the physiology next week. Any questions on the anatomy of the thyroid? So before I move away from that to the adrenal glands, we should talk about the parathyroid gland. So on the posterior aspect, we could just pretend this is posterior. You've got an average of 4 parathyroid glands. There have been reports of as many as 8. Some people have as few as 2, but in general we have 4 parathyroid glands. And our parathyroid glands work the opposite of calcitonin. They release parathyroid hormone, which is going to be released when blood calcium levels are low. So they release PTH, which is parathyroid hormone. The cells in the parathyroid gland, different books call them different things. Some books just call them parathyroid cells. Your book calls them chief cells or principal cells. The problem with calling them chief cells is we also have chief cells in our digestive tract. So I don't know. You can call them principal cells, you can call them chief cells, you can call them parathyroid cells, as long as we are talking about the context of parathyroid hormones, it'll know that you're talking about the chief cells in the parathyroid gland. All right, any questions on the thyroid or parathyroid? Let me see, I'm going to skip ahead and see if I have a little, okay. I do have a question, but I don't know if I have the one I really want to ask you. They actually discovered the parathyroid glands on accident. So thyroid problems can be pretty common. You can have hyperthyroid conditions or hypothyroid conditions, both of which can cause a goiter. So your book has goiters listed, and it's this really enlarged, huge thyroid. And that can happen for a couple reasons. A lot of times it can be because of iodine deficiency. Thyroid hormone synthesis requires iodine. So if you don't have iodine, you can't make appropriate thyroid hormone. So the negative feedback loop would be saying to your hypothalamus, there's no thyroid hormone. So it's going to release TRH, you'll release TSH, it'll stimulate your thyroid. If you can't make thyroid hormone, then you're just going to keep stimulating that thyroid. It'll get bigger and bigger and bigger. And so that can be one case. Also, if you're hypothyroid, if you're just not making thyroid hormone for another reason, or sometimes you can have these pituitary adenomas that are spontaneously secreting TSH, and so those can't be regulated, and it'll cause this huge growth of your thyroid gland. And so if you've got those problems, then a lot of times they'll just take out your thyroid. And that's how they discovered the parathyroid glands, is that people who were having their thyroids removed were dying very shortly after, because they were having all sorts of problems with muscle contraction. And I mean, if you think about it, if parathyroid glands are releasing parathyroid hormone when calcium levels are low, then these are going to be really important to helping maintain the homeostatic balance of calcium. Calcium is needed for neuronal signaling, it's needed for muscle contraction, so it's got to be kept in pretty tight homeostatic range. Calcium is a really important chemical for signaling, so if we don't have it, we need to be able to do this. So they were removing people's thyroids, and then these people a couple days later were starting to have muscle contraction problems. And then they were just keeling over and dying. So people were like, why is this happening? And they realized it's because when they were removing the thyroids, they were taking the parathyroid glands as well. And so these people were losing not only their thyroid hormone and their calcitonin, but their parathyroid hormone as well. And by far, the more physiological significant or situation in the body is drops in calcium. It's very rare that you're high in calcium. So that is just kind of an interesting thing to be aware of. But that they totally found it by accident by killing people by removing their thyroid gland. All right, any questions? Then our next glands are our adrenal glands. And our adrenal glands sit on top of our kidneys. So, see if I've got a good one back here. I don't think so. Here, I'll use the kidney model. So, our adrenal glands sit on top of our kidneys, and they've got two regions. An outer cortex and an inner medulla. And these are doing different things. So, if we look at our adrenal glands, they've got an outer cortex and an inner medulla. The medulla is modified nervous tissue that is responding to the sympathetic nervous system directly by releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine. And you should have talked about this a little bit when you talked about the autonomic nervous system last semester. So these are our fight or flight hormones. And when your sympathetic nervous system is activated, norepinephrine and epinephrine can be released from the adrenal medulla and basically increase the response of everything that's happening with your sympathetic nervous system. So your sympathetic nervous system is increasing heart rate. Norepinephrine and epinephrine will bind to adrenergic receptors in your heart and help to further increase the rate and strength of contraction. So norepinephrine and norepinephrine are very important for our fight or flight response. The adrenal cortex is this outer layer, and it's actually got several layers itself. So I'm going to draw a cross section. If we were to cut out a piece of this kidney, or I'm sorry, of this adrenal gland, and look at it, then it's got a bunch of sections that we need to talk about. It's got a connective tissue capsule that holds it all together. It's not really that interesting because it's not doing much. Then we've got this little region up top called the Zona Glomerulosa. Cells in the Zona Glomerulosa are going to be responding to this when we've got a drop in, or when we get dehydrated. They're going to be able to release hormones that are going to help to bring up our water level, our mineralocorticoids. And these are going to respond to a hormone called angiotensin II. And release this hormone called aldosterone. Aldosterone, it fits this category mineralocorticoid. Our mineralocorticoids have to do with our mineral balance or our sodium balance. So aldosterone is going to target the kidneys and cause them to uptake sodium. And with sodium follows water. So aldosterone will stimulate the kidneys to uptake sodium, water follows, then you retain more water. So when your blood pressure drops, this can be activated. We're going to look at this whole big system, the renin-angiotensin system, that gets going, and it will cause the release of angiotensin II and antidiuretic hormone, because both of those hormones are going to work on the kidneys in different ways to increase water absorption. So that's our first layer, the Zona Glomerulosa. It's releasing this general category called mineralocorticoids. Specifically in humans, the mineralocorticoid is aldosterone, and it's released in response to angiotensin II. Our next region down is called the Zona fasciculata. It's kind of got a weird spelling because it's got this silent C. It's Fasciculata. The zona fasciculata. The zona fasciculata is responding to ACTH, or our adrenal corticotropic hormone. So this is the adrenal gland. Corticotropic, it's releasing this category of hormones called glucocorticoids. In humans, the glucocorticoid that we have is called cortisol. Some other animals have one called corticosterone. We just release cortisol. This is our stress hormone. So we'll talk more about what it does on Monday. The last layer of the adrenal cortex is called the Zona Reticularis. And it responds a little bit to ACTH, but it's got more further complex regulation that I'm not going to make you worry too much about. What it releases are what are called our Adrenal Androgens. Specifically, they're called DHEA and DHEAS. And then deep to our cortex is the medulla that's releasing norepinephrine and epinephrine. So our adrenal androgens could also be called gonatocorticoids. So can you guess, based on the name, what chemical class these hormones fall under? Yeah, they're steroids. So every one of these is a different version of a steroid. So these are all steroid hormones by chemical class, and they are just regular hormones by method of release. Now, in our medulla, norepinephrine and epinephrine are modified amino acids. And technically that's modified nervous tissue, so you could have an argument about whether it's a hormone or a neurohormone, and I wouldn't trick question you or anything like that because it depends on who you are, which one you're going to call it. So I forgot to be doing our method of releasing chemical for our other hormones, so please forgive me. I'm telling you, it's pregnancy, it takes away your brain. Melatonin is also a modified amino acid. And it's a hormone by method of release. Thyroid hormone? Thyroid hormone's tricky because it's a hormone by method of release. Its chemical class is that it's a modified amino acid, but it behaves like a steroid. So this is the one exception, and I love exceptions for multiple choice questions. So be aware of that. It's a modified amino acid, but it behaves like a steroid. And then all of our adrenal hormones, well, all of our adrenal cortex hormones, our steroid hormones, and our adrenal medulla hormones are modified amino acids. Parathyroid hormone is a peptide and protein. Thank you. Good question. And we would also call it hormone by method of release. So parathyroid hormone is a peptide protein, and it's just a regular hormone by method of release coming from a gland into the blood. Calcitonin is also hormone by method of release, and it's a peptide or protein. All right. Any questions? So next is our pancreas. It's this weird organ, this weird long organ that sits just inferior and kind of posterior to your stomach, and it is going to link up with your small intestine, so it gets hugged by your small intestine there. And it's got two parts. It's got what are called pancreatic acids. And if you recall from last semester when we were talking about exocrine glands, we said that acinar glands are like these glands that they bulb out at the bottom. And so you have to look at the slides of the pancreas now and be able to distinguish between an acinar, a pancreatic acini, and our pancreatic islets. The acini are the exocrine parts. So these are exocrine, and they release pancreatic juice, which is important for digestion. So we're not really going to talk about it anymore right now, but you do have to be able to recognize the difference between our pancreatic acini and our pancreatic islets. So I'll just kind of draw out a little picture to show you how to distinguish them under the scope. So if you remember our acinar glands, they are going to have these cells that secrete a product that goes into a duct. So when you look under the scope, you can kind of see that they're neatly organized around what's going to be a duct. So they kind of look, I always say these are like small groups of big cells. And so you don't generally see the duct. A lot of times what you'll see under the scope looks just like this. And those are our pancreatic acinar cells that are releasing our pancreatic juice for digestion. The other big globs of cells that you see in the pancreas are called pancreatic islets, or islets of Langerhans. And they've got 4 different cell types in them. I'm only going to make you worry about 2 cells. And these are big groups of small cells. So don't worry, I'll help you figure out the difference when you're looking at the slide, because it can be kind of hard to see at first. But once you learn to recognize them, they're pretty easy to see. So our pancreatic islets, the 2 cell types that I'm going to have you worry about are our alpha and our beta cells. And these are releasing insulin and glucagon. And how I remember which do which is alpha release glucagon. So there's an A in glucagon, A in alpha. Alpha cells release glucagon. Our beta cells release insulin. And these hormones are antagonists. They work insulin when glucose levels are high, glucagon when glucose levels are low. We'll talk more about the physiology next week, but this is just our introduction to anatomy. Any questions on that? All right. So is everybody good on this? Our alpha cells are releasing glucagon, our beta cells are releasing insulin, our acinar cells are releasing pancreatic juice. So we will have to look at these slides again at the end of the semester, or when we get to digestive system, and you're going to have to be able to recognize them again. But if you can see the difference now, then it's not that confusing later.